Hey, good morning, guys. This is your Chapter 3 video lecture. This is the name of the chapter is Principles of Motion and Stability. This is one of my favorite chapters because really it starts to, get into concepts related to motor development in terms of what you're expecting from this course. Trying to understand how people develop movements either from infancy to adulthood, or from beginner to proficient, from injury to recovery. We're gonna get into some I guess some new concepts that you haven't really discussed in other courses. But I'd like to start off with this concept called the open kinetic chain, and this is going to be the beginnings of your final presentation in this course. If you look at the title of the presentation, it's called the open kinetic chain presentation, video presentation. So just so that you can understand what the open kinetic chain is, let's look at the definition from the book. It says here, the sequential and appropriately timed movement of all body parts involved in the execution of a well-coordinated and efficient skill or movement. And if you think about it, the open kinetic chain applies to any movement, whether you're kicking a soccer ball or shooting a basket or throwing a baseball or executing a power clean. The open kinetic chain applies to overall movement, but really what we're looking at is all of the isolated movements that are associated with the overall movement. So, for example, if we're throwing a ball, or let's just throw a ball. Throwing a ball doesn't just require the arm. It requires, certain feet work. It requires, certain stance. It requires bending at the knees, bending at the hips, rotating the body. So there's several isolated movements even before you get into the description of the arm movements. You have extension, extension of the shoulder. You have flexion of the elbow. Then you have full extension. There's lots that goes on, inside the body in terms of, in order to make a proficient throw. So that's at the proficient level. But at the beginner level, if you look at anybody throwing, if this was a face-to-face class, we would go out into the soccer field and let people, engage in throwing, so that everyone in class can see the differences between those who are beginners and those who are proficient. But the beginner throwers, they probably just use their arm, and there's a big difference in the execution or the output. Someone who just uses their arms can only throw the ball, at most 20 feet. Whereas somebody who knows how to fully execute the throwing of a ball, with the proper feet work, proper stance, the entirety of all the isolated chains isolated movements at every joint, they could throw a baseball anywhere between 200 and 300 feet. And that's the reason why. So today, we're going to start with this discussion, and ultimately I want you guys to start to understand the open kinetic chain. Okay? Now, if this was a face-to-face class, what we would do in class, I thought about just deleting the slide from this video lecture, but at least I think you can, in your mind, think about, some of the things that I would ask you to do if you're in a class. So I would ask you to think of a skill or movement that you do well, that you in particular do well. So if you're an athlete, think of the movements that you do in your sport, or if you exercise on a frequent basis, think about the things that you do and you do them well. So I would ask you to perform the skill and analyze all the movements required to execute that skill, and pretty much that's what you would do. What I just described in throwing a baseball, you would perform the skill and think about everything that's required in order to perform the skill. Now, if you said, let's say we said a back squat, for example. A back squat is just not lowering the bar and raising it again. A back squat requires you to, flex at the hips, flex at the knees. That allows you to, to bring the bar down. There's also, what would that be? Dorsiflexion of the ankles. Okay, and that's in order for you to lower the bar. So doing a back squat isn't about I would lower the bar, I would raise the bar. No, it would be I have to perform hip flexion, and knee flexion and dorsiflexion in order for the bar to move downward. All right. Now, if you think about that, all of those isolated movements. Okay, so all of those isolated movements are angular in nature, in terms of moving around the joints. So if you haven't taken biomechanics yet, which all of you are required to do so, I break down the course into angular motion and linear motion. Linear motion is the result of angular motion. Okay, so in order for the bar to move straight down as your body lowers, the bar moves in a straight line. That's linear motion. But our body doesn't work that way. Our body works in angular motion. All of our movement occurs around the joint. Okay, so there's no movement in our body moves angularly. Linearly. Every movement in our body moves angularly. You can see my hand moving around my wrist joint. Okay, I can't move my hand linear. Now I can move my hand linear like this. Now that's linear motion, but that requires several isolated movements at joints. So how can I move my hand like this? Well, there's angular motion at my shoulder joint. Okay, and that's how I'm able to move my hand in a linear motion. And if I really want to move it in linear motion, I have to actually move my wrist in order to keep it linear. All right, so if you do that, whenever you start to extend out, if you want your wrist, your hand to be linear, you have to either flex or extend your wrist. And you also, now that I think about it, you also have to go from a flexed elbow to an extended elbow. Okay, so in order for my hand to move linearly, there's 3 isolated movements that have to occur at my shoulder, my elbow, and my wrist in order for my hand to move linearly. Okay, so linear motion is the product of angular motion. Okay, all of our movements inside our body are angular in nature. Okay, they move around the joints. So whenever you look at a back squat, if I was to lower the bar, even though the bar looks like it's lowering in a straight line, it's the result of 3 isolated angular motion, which is flexion of the hips, flexion of the knees, and dorsiflexion of the ankles. Okay, and we can analyze. So what I want you to do is, just for now, just think about activities that you do well, and think about all of the motions, all of the movements that have to occur for you to move proficiently. Okay, this is proficient, something that you do well, something that you do proficiently. Don't think of like, well, I've never thrown a baseball before, but I'm going to throw a baseball, because more than likely you'll just do like one simple movement, and that's not what I'm asking you to do. Now, if you're a pitcher, then think about, what it takes. Every movement, every isolated movement that it takes for you to throw a pitch well. Okay? So, yeah, there is a windup. There is a lot of movement even before you even release the ball in order for you to perform that skill proficiently. Okay? So that's what I would ask you to do. And, this is where we're starting to think about movement and the development of movement. And it does apply to normal human movement, walking, running, jumping. But then it also applies to proficient movement at particular skills, like hitting a baseball, shooting a basket, things that require years of training to eventually master. Okay, so going back to this activity, think about how a novice or a beginner would perform the skill. And then, again, compare the difference between that beginner and the one who can perform the skill at a proficient level. So, again, looking at a basketball, looking at a baseball toss, a beginner would just use their arm and their elbow, or their shoulder and their elbow and their wrist to just throw the ball, 20 or 30, not even 20 feet. Whereas those who are throwing the ball 230 yards, 200 or 300 feet, requires a lot more isolated movements in a sequential and well-timed or appropriately timed manner in order to perform that skill proficiently. Okay, that's the open kinetic chain. Okay. My screen's frozen. Okay. All right. So let's look at these videos. You can see that these videos are there's infants in all of these videos, and what I'm going to do over the next 2 slides is compare movements well, in this case, infants. So these are beginners, and then I'm going to show you the same movements among those who are much more proficient at performing the same skills. Alright, so the first example in the first video is a child performing a standing log jump. Okay, not a long video, but imagine this is what a beginner would look like. Even if you're an adult, if you've never done a standing log jump, you know, there's a chance that you would look like this. Okay, so, I mean, think about what the child, you know, just, you know, before we move on, think about what the child, you know, what must be going through the child's mind at this point. Now, in terms of fear, I couldn't say that the child is fearful of his life. You know, it's not like life-threatening, but there is a sense of you know, I guess confusion or lack of confidence. You know, I've never done this before, so it's almost like I have to think about what I'm doing. And if you think about it, that's the way we perform all movement. If you've done something for the first time, you actually have to kind of think about what you're doing. You know, I know all of us have been walkers for 20 years or so, and we don't remember the first time we took our first step. But if you watch babies, you know, attempting to take their first step, it's like they grab on the furniture, you know, and they hold themselves up, and they're thinking about, okay, I have to put my right foot forward, and then I have to kind of push off with my left foot. And I mean, it sounds comical, but that's what we do. I mean, think about the last time you did something for the first time. You actually had to think about it. You just didn't go on and just get up and start, you know, you weren't like riding a bike like Lance Armstrong. You know, you weren't, you know, throwing a ball like, you know, like Randy Johnson. I mean, you actually had to think about, let me figure this out, and then after a couple of times of practice, perhaps you became more proficient. Maybe in some cases it takes years of training to become highly proficient. Okay? So the child, you know, doing the long jump is actually having to think about it. Okay, let me try to get this video back up. Alright, so that's the standing long jump. Let's look at this child throwing a ball. This is a child throwing a ball, you know, for one of the first times in his life. And he's like, how do I... Oh, there it is. You know, he has to think about it. You know, it's not something that's just easy. He's, you know, again, he's not necessarily fearful for his life, but he kind of feels, you know, and as you will too, as you do too, whenever you perform something for the first time, he kind of feels like if he does something too quickly, he may fall. And if you fall, there's a chance that you hurt yourself. So there is that sense of fear the first time you do something. Okay? You want to make, you know, and really it's the balance versus mobility. It's balance versus motion trade-off, and that's what I'll talk about in a second. But let me just show you the video again. He knows he wants to throw it, and he also realizes that his body's in an awkward position, and now he's in a higher likelihood of falling. Which again, you know, if he's fallen a couple of times in his life, even at an early age, you know, you realize there's a chance for pain. So he's fearful of that pain. That's why, you know, I mean, again, it sounds comical, but that's what we do. Think about it. I mean, I remember this summer I went to the swimming pool with my son, and there was like an 11-foot diving board. And my son was just jumping off like crazy. And he was like, come on, Dad, you know, get on. And I was like, okay, I'll show you. I can do it. And I got up there, and I walked out with confidence because I'm a confident walker, you know. Like, I've walked for, you know, all my life almost. So it was easy to walk onto the platform, but whenever I approached the edge and there was no more rail, and it was just a diving board, and that was it, yeah, I I got scared. It took me a while to, like, you know, kind of convince myself that it's going to be okay. But, you know, after I jumped the first time and the second time, you know, third, fourth, fifth time, it was cake. But that first time, I thought about, oh my gosh, if I do something wrong, I could get hurt. And, well, at least that was what was going on in my mind. Okay, and that's what's happening with this kid, you know. And I mean, it's not that he can tell you the reason why I'm reluctant is because I'm afraid I'm going to get hurt. But our body tells us that. Okay, this last example is a child kicking a ball. And as you might imagine, a child can't kick a ball like a professional kicker. They're trying to figure it out. And they realize that if I put my leg, I mean, this is, again, the balance versus mobility trade-off. They realize that in order to kick the ball, they have to momentarily, I'm trying to get this video off or this preview. I don't know how to do this. Well, anyways, they know that in order to kick the ball, they have to momentarily be on one foot. And again, that raises fear of falling. So they don't want to pick up their foot too high. And if they're not if they're not picking up their foot too high, then they're not able to kick the ball as proficiently as they could if they were to fully cock or bend their limb and then be able to deliver as much force to the ball as possible, like a proficient kicker will. But in this case, I'm sorry, this little excerpt is, you know, in the way. I can't get it off. I wish I could. Let me try to replay it again. There we go. So they kick the ball, and like even there, he's having to hold, or she is having to hold the table in order to maintain balance, because again, there's a fear of falling, and that's a natural fear that everyone experiences. Can't even. There we go. All right, there we go. So, just to give you some perspective, I have video of all three movements, but amongst proficient individuals. Okay, so the first example is a standing long jump. This is Julio Jones, who's an NFL football player. Okay, he's a professional football player. This is during his combine. It doesn't matter. He's already 23 years old, and he's an elite athlete. And look at the difference between the child standing long jump and Julio Jones's.
Yeah, he may get to 11 feet. Oh, that was a great jump. He may get to 11 feet. But the problem is you got to stick it because you get tired after 2 or 3. Sure. Your legs wear out. Sure. You got to stick the jump. You got to stick it. It's like retakes on Sunday.
Okay, so this is a proficient jump. All right, whether it's an NFL football player or someone in this class. I mean, at some point, you become proficient at standing long jump. Now, the difference between you and Julio Jones is that he's 6'5", 6'6", and, you know, he's just an elite athlete. I mean, that'd be the only difference in output. But in terms of process is the same. I mean, if you look at them, let me show you again.
Yeah, he may get to 11 feet. Oh, that was a great jump. He may get to 11 feet. But the problem is you got to stick it because you get tired after 2 or 3. Sure. Your legs wear out. Sure. You got to stick the jump. You got to stick it. It's like retakes on Sunday.
Okay, so the first thing, he's got the violent arm swings. You know, that's associated with a proficient jump. The previous child attempted an arm swing, but it was not violent. He just kind of went, you know, okay, I know I need to start from back here, but for sure, I'm not going to be violent in this thing and really lose my balance, which increases the likelihood of me falling. Julio Jones is so confident, and not only Julio Jones, but, I mean, even you and I would be so confident that we can maintain our stability even with engaging in a violent arm swing, that it doesn't, you know, we lose the fear of falling at some point in our lives. Okay, and it's relatively soon. All right. And then the other thing is that he's got the violent arm swings. And then if I could stop it correctly, he's got much more hip flexion. He's got much more knee flexion. He's got much more dorsiflexion than the infant. You know, the infant is stiff, doesn't quite understand, or doesn't quite have the confidence enough to be able to bend the joints. And whenever the more joints we bend, the more balance we lose. So again, it's the balance stability. I mean, it's the balance mobility trade-off, which again I'll talk about in a second after we get through these videos. All right, so this is a Major League Baseball player throwing, and I'm just using these videos because that's what I found on YouTube. So it just so happens to be that most YouTubers are professional throwers, but you could see the difference in the way this Aaron Hicks throws opposed to the infant. There's a lot more going on with the body. The infant, all he really did was just kind of, twist his body, and it wasn't even, he wasn't even cocking his arm. He was twisting his body in an effort to bring the ball back. He really wasn't twisting his body to create any type of torque or to generate any type of force. It was more about just, maintaining balance while trying to throw the ball out. And even then, he just simply pushed it. But whenever we see a thrower, a proficient thrower, and in this case, it just so happens to be a Major League baseball player.
Aaron Hicks,
obviously can throw a lot farther, but that's a lot of that is a product of his physical characteristics, his individual characteristics. But in terms of proficiency, at some point, anyone who attempts to throw eventually becomes this proficient.
Hicks makes a catch. Valencia attacks here for
So what's really required for a throw? At this point, he had just thrown himself into the air in order to, and he turned his body to the point where, if he wouldn't have planted right now, so you can see he's planted with his right foot. If he didn't plant, he would have landed sideways. So he actually threw his body into the air, landed in order to start generating force, which we'll talk about in a second. Right now his hips are flexed, his knees are flexed. He's performing hip abduction whenever you push away from the midline in order to generate force off the ground. And not only that, he's got rotational force, and then he's got his arm flexion and extension and rotation. There's a lot going on. All right, but that's what I'm saying. That's what the open kinetic chain is a series of isolated movements that occur sequentially and appropriately timed. And if you think about the skills that you do well, again, if you're a soccer player, think about, shooting a goal or making a cross-field pass or, throwing the ball in, whatever it is that you do, think about all of the movements that are required to do so. Okay, and for your presentation, you're also going to describe what it looks like among beginners. For someone who's doing it for the first time, and you're going to discuss the errors or the characteristics of a novice or a beginner, and then eventually in your presentation, you're going to show the class the type of training that you would put your participant in order to improve proficiency. Okay, now let's look at the kicker. So remember the previous slide, there was an infant kicker who didn't even bend their leg, right, in order to kick the ball. Well, this is a high school or a soccer or college kicker, and look at how much. They don't kick the ball with a straight leg like the infant did. Let me see if I can stop it right at the point where the leg is cocked. All right, that's at full extension. Almost got it. Just so I can do it without playing it. All right, you can see how far his leg had come back compared to the previous slide with the infant who didn't even bring their leg back. They were standing still, and from there they just kicked the ball. They just kicked it. There was no there was no preparation, no preparatory movement. It was simply just kick the ball and not lose any balance. This kicker is, I mean, think about that. You can't even stand like that. All right, he's on one foot, yes, but his center of gravity is so far away from his stability point that there's no way if he tried to do this that he could stand upright by himself. But he realizes at some point in his life he established enough confidence, just like you and I would, to where he realizes I could stand on one foot momentarily and not lose, and not fall. I'm losing balance, but I'm undergoing such a violent movement that speed actually creates balance for me, and that's what's happening with this kick. He never falls on the ground; he just reestablishes his balance point. You can see again. There's the cock. There's the leg cock or the leg swing or whatever it is. Okay, so obviously a lot different, but if you think about it, there's lots going on in this, and even if you eliminate his preparatory steps towards the ball, like right now, he's going to engage in the preparatory steps, and it's really not until just before that. Here, let me try to rewind it. All right, it's right at this point when his left foot plants on the ground. That's when the actual kick begins. Right now, he's finalizing his preparatory steps. So whenever his leg touches ground, that's when the kick actually begins. Alright, well, I can't get it. I guess my computer or my fingers are too slow, I guess. But hopefully you guys understand what I'm talking about. The kick doesn't begin, 5 yards away from the ball. The kick begins whenever he plants and his leg is cocked, ready to start violently moving forward towards the ball to deliver the force in order to, propel the ball into the air. Okay, so that's the difference between, the beginner and the proficient. And what I'm hoping that you start to understand is this concept of an open kinetic chain. And if you start reflecting on the skills that you in particular perform well, and you start breaking all of the isolated movement, and think about it. I mean, move slowly. Do your movement, and then think about, okay, if I do this, I recognize that there's dorsiflexion. I recognize there's knee flexion. I recognize there's knee extension. I recognize, and you start to realize that all of the series of movements, of isolated movements that have to occur in order for you to perform the skill at a proficient level. Okay. All right, so now that we've discussed the open kinetic chain, and hopefully you've gotten some examples, now we can discuss, we can start getting into the content of this chapter, and one of them being the boundaries of physical laws. Okay, and so it says here, when we first perform skills, we recognize the physical laws that limit our movement. Okay, so again, going back to the beginners, beginners realize, even infants, they may not have the cognitive skills to recognize, but their body does recognize it. If I lose my balance, I will fall. And if I fall, there's a chance I may get hurt. So it creates a fear for us. And we do the same thing. I mean, maybe not if you're a right-handed rider and you start riding with your left hand, you may not have that fear. But for sure, if you're doing general gross movements like, shooting a basket or kicking a ball or, throwing a baseball or swinging a bat, I mean, there's a certain fear that your body experiences, even if you don't know it, because, there's a realization that, there's a chance you may fall, and that could lead to injury. Okay. But when we engage in particular movements, okay, yeah, well, that's pretty much what I was saying. Okay, so then we engage in particular movements that encourage us to perform the particular movements, so all of the isolated movements that allow us to execute the open kinetic chain of that skill. So, again, going from beginner and progressing all the way through proficient. Okay. Okay, so early in life, or beginners, or patients relearning skills. Okay, so all three of these situations are similar in the fact that, you know, they're either learning new skills or they're having to relearn the skills that have once, you know, that they once knew. Okay, so this is kind of creating the context of your case study video presentation. You know, and I'm going to give you detailed instructions on both, but for the case study, I'm going to give you a case. I'm going to give you someone who's either early in life, or who's a beginner, or who's a patient, you know, who's recovering from injury, and I'm going to ask you to guide them through a particular skill. So you're going to have to, you know, assess the situation that I give you, and then, you know, in other words, essentially you're going to devise a plan that will help them become proficient at the skill that they're trying to achieve. Okay, so that's the case study. The only difference between the case study and the open kinetic chain video is the open kinetic chain video. You'll be doing the skills that you want to do. With the case study video presentation, you'll be given a situation. You'll have to describe, you know, the process of you improving that person with the situation you were given. So very similar, but some differences there. Okay. Well, anyways. So you have so in early in life, or if you're a beginner, or if you're a patient relearning these skills, you know, obviously the task isn't simple at first. There's lots of inefficient or jerky movement. Now, inefficient movement is movement that occurs outside the planes necessary for that particular movement. And if you know anything about biomechanics, we have sagittal plane, which is, you know, just like a plane that divides our body into right and left, or, you know, not necessarily right, equally right and half parts, but, you know, it divides the body into right and left. So we have planes like, you know, running, for example, we run in the sagittal plane. Now, if you do any movement that's outside the sagittal plane, that's inefficient, that's wasted movement. So, you know, if you look at like world-class track athletes, they don't have any wasted movement. All of their movement is straight on the sagittal plane. You know, and their knees and their feet and everything is straight in this plane. If they have any movement here, that's a split second off their 100, and that's the difference between, you know, going to the Olympics and not. You know, so they really train on engaging in proficient movement or efficient movement. But at first, you know, the first time you do anything, it's inefficient and jerky because you're trying to maintain or trying to establish a balance between balance or stability and speed or mobility. Okay, so that's the balance, speed, or the stability, mobility trade-off. Okay, and that's what we're doing. We're calibrating our movements. We're trying to establish confidence that we can, I guess, rely less and less on balance, and rely more and more on speed in order to execute the skill. Okay, so that's what the balance speed trade-off is. We try to optimize one aspect of movement, balance, at the expense of another, speed, in order to increase likelihood of success. Eventually, when we become proficient, then we rely less on balance and we rely more on speed, and that's where our movements become smoother and more coordinated. Okay? Okay, and that's pretty much. I mean, this slide is, you know, pretty much concepts that I've already discussed throughout the discussion so far. But eventually, you know, with experience and training, you know, our movements become proficient. And at that point, the only differences between individuals is the physical makeup. I mean, you know, if I try to dunk a basketball at my height, you know, I'm not going to have very much success. But, you know, someone else who's 6'5" and who has the physical makeup to jump a lot higher than I do, and we perform the same movement, you know, their result is going to be a lot different than mine, even though we're performing the exact same movement. It's just that, you know, there's just individual characteristics that allow certain people to produce certain results or more results than others, and that's the only differences between individuals. Okay, so in this slide, before I get into Newton's laws of motion, you know, part of becoming proficient is the ability to generate greater force outputs. Okay. Now I'm going to discuss force, and that's going to lead us into Newton's laws of motion. Okay. So to move either themselves as a body or objects, individuals must produce force. So in all of the videos that we saw earlier, we looked at the beginners, the infants, they were producing force, but the force they were producing was minimal because their movements were inefficient. They were beginners. They were novice. There wasn't a lot of isolated, well-timed or sequential series of isolated movements. So it was very basic movement, and it produced very minimal force. Okay. Now, Newton's laws of motion give us an understanding of what happens when we produce force. So first, with his first law of motion, Newton, if you don't know who Newton is, Isaac Newton is like the father of physics. And his concepts or laws, they're fact no matter where we are in the universe. So his first law of motion states that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. Okay? And if you think about that, it's true. Because in order for us to move, we have to produce force. Okay? Now, there's two types of forces. There's internal force, and there's external force. Internal force is the force that we can generate with our body. Every time we move our body, we are generating an internal force. Now, in order for that internal force to be applied or to be applied to anything outside of our body, to anything external, we have to be acted upon by an outside force. Okay? Now, just to give you perspective on what this means, imagine if you were floating in space. If you've seen the movie The Martian or Gravity or any other space movie, you know what I'm talking about. If you're just floating in space. So if you're floating in space and you're doing jumping jacks, it doesn't do anything. If you're floating in space and you're performing a running motion, it doesn't do anything. You're still going to be floating in space. The only thing is that you'll be floating in space doing jumping jacks, or you'll be floating in space, performing a running motion. But that motion is not doing anything. And the simple reason is because you're not being acted upon by an outside force. And that's the truth. Now, if you were, if you're running and you so happen to step on a rock, then yes, that would prepare you to engage or to be redirected in a different motion or in a different, you won't be moving sideways anymore. You'll actually go forward. And again, think about those movies, like in Gravity. I think one time Sandra Bullock, there was like an explosion or something, and she was forced away from the rocket, and she was floating at a very slow speed, but she had no control of that trajectory. She wasn't acted upon by any outside force, and she just kept on drifting away slowly and slowly, where she was further and further away, to the point where she was a long ways away from that rocket ship, and it required I think it was George Clooney to kind of navigate through space with that propulsion pack that he had that allowed him to with those jet propulsions, those jets that he had, to be able to get to her, retrieve her, and bring her back to the ship. All right, so that was the outside force. The outside force for him was those jets. The outside force for Sandra Bullock was George Clooney, getting her. Okay, now on Earth, what is the outside force that we use? Because we obviously have an outside force in order for us to move. We don't, if we do a running motion, we run. If we do jumping jacks, we do jumping jacks. If we, move side to side, if we shuffle, we move. So what's the outside force? Well, I'm going to skip ahead and go to Newton's third law of motion. His third law of motion, so Newton's first law of motion is an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion until acted upon by a force, by an outside force. Okay? Newton's third law of motion states that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Okay? So on Earth, whenever you want to step forward, you have to push down on the ground and back, okay? Now, if you did that in space, if you step down, if you push down and back in space, nothing would happen. You would just be doing that in air. You would just be doing that and nothing would happen. You wouldn't start walking in space. You would be performing a walking motion, but you'd still be drifting in space because there is no outside force. So what is the equal and opposite reaction? Well, it's the ground pushing upward and forward on you. Now, you might think that's ridiculous, but it's true. Whenever you step down, the ground pushes forward on you. That's why you don't sink. Now, whenever you push backward, the ground pushes forward on you, and that's what propels you forward. Okay, so there is an equal and opposite reaction to every one of your actions. That allows us to perform movement. Okay, so I'll come back to this in a second, but I did want you to realize that there is an outside force whenever we're on Earth. Okay. Okay, so since an object at rest stays at rest and an object in motion stays in motion, that's what they want to do. Okay, so the object at rest wants to stay at rest, so it has a resistance to change of motion. It has a resistance to move. If it's at rest, it wants to stay at rest. All right, so there's a resistance to move. All right, an object in motion wants to stay in motion. It doesn't want to change motion. It wants to stay in motion. So there's a resistance to a change in motion. Okay? So that resistance to a change of motion is called in objects inertia. All right? Inertia, and just to give you perspective, is measured in kilograms. Okay? So and so is mass. Mass is a measure of inertia. Okay? You'll learn this in biomechanics. But let's say you take me and you take a small student, a small female student, let's say, just to make a drastic change. My mass is about 200 kilograms, or is it 100 kilograms? It's 100 kilograms because I weigh about 200, a little over 200 pounds. Okay, so it's 100 kilograms, where that small female student, her mass may only be 25 kilograms. All right, the numbers really don't mean anything to us right now. But what does matter is that since my mass is 100 kilograms and her mass is 25 kilograms, I obviously have a greater mass. What that really means is that I have a greater resistance to a change in motion. Okay? So if you think about it, if I'm standing still and she's standing still, okay? We both are standing still, meaning we have zero motion. All right, so in physics, we would say that's zero velocity, but for now, we're in zero motion. So we both have a resistance to the change of motion. We want to stay motionless, okay, unless acted upon by an outside force. That inertia is the resistance to a change of motion. So since she has less inertia, 25 kilograms compared to 100, she has less inertia. It takes less to get her to change her motion. So all you have to do is generate a little force and push to her, and she will start moving. But if you perform that same push to me, since I have a greater inertia, greater mass, I wouldn't move because it requires more push, more force in order to get me moving. Okay? So that's where we see the term inertia. So why is that so important? Well, if you think about it, if you think about kicking a soccer ball is sitting still on the ground. It has little inertia, but it does have inertia, meaning that it has a resistance to the change of movement. It doesn't want to move. It's standing still. But in order to move it, let's say you kick it, okay? So if you kick it with just a little bit of force, the ball should start moving. So the inertia is not too great. But if that same ball was a bowling ball, let's say you had a bowling ball sitting on the ground, and you tried to push it with just a nudge, it wouldn't move. It wouldn't move. So it requires you to generate even more force in order for you to move that bowling ball. Okay, so that's how we determine. That's one of the laws that we use to determine motion. All right, so we realize that if I need to shoot a basketball, I need to produce force, but Newton's first law of motion allows us to determine how much force is really needed. If I need a lot of force, then I generate a lot of force. If I don't need a lot of force, then I don't need a lot of force. And I mean, from a common sense standpoint, this makes sense. It's common sense. But if you think about it in development, especially among infants and youth and kids and beginners, lots of times they don't realize how much strength is really needed to produce the force needed to move the object, and that's why motions are typically jerky or inefficient or awkward at first, because they haven't yet had a chance to calibrate that movement, and this is one of the reasons why. Okay. So it's Newton's first law of motion. I mean, the law of motion states an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion until acted upon the outside force. But really, the key concept here is the inertia. Not quite understanding until you get a feel for it, the understanding of how much inertia the object really has, or how much force is actually really needed to generate the movement. Okay, so that's Newton's first law of motion. All right, moving on to Newton's second law of motion. It says here that the force generated by a body or object is related to that body or object's mass and acceleration. So pretty much what this is saying is that force is equal to mass times acceleration. Okay? All right, so what does this really mean? What does this mean in motor development context? It's stating that the force produced by an object or a body, okay, is related to its mass. Okay, so the object or body has a mass that it's actually using to apply to a force, but it's also related to the acceleration in the direction at which the force is applied. Okay, so if you think about it, let's look at the examples of the jump, the throws and the kicks. You know what? Let's look at the kick. I think the kick will be the best example of these three examples. Okay, the infant's foot has a mass. Okay, so whenever that mass is applied to an object, it's gonna generate a force to that object. Okay, now the acceleration is dependent upon the distance between the starting point of the kick and the ending point of the kick. Okay, so if you remember the video, the infant didn't bend. There was no preparatory phase. There was no cocking or stroking of the leg. Standing still, and from that point, his foot went boom, and that's it. That was it. So whatever acceleration, and acceleration is simply a change in motion. All right. So if you go from zero velocity to some velocity, I mean, let's say it's 2 meters per second. I don't know, whatever. Any change in velocity is called acceleration. Acceleration is the change in velocity. Okay, so if you go from still to whatever velocity the foot reached at the point of kick, all right, so that's going to be a change in velocity. That's acceleration, but that's minimal acceleration. I mean, there's a minimal opportunity for acceleration. Now, if that child would have cocked first, and then from a full cocked position, kick the ball, that distance would have allowed for an increase of acceleration. Okay, same mass, different acceleration. All right, so that difference in acceleration is what results in greater force output. Okay, and that's what this law is saying. So if you think about it, if you look at like all of the examples, the infant jump, there was minimal isolated movements. There was minimal open kinetic chain. I mean, basically he went from stiff-legged, stance to stiff-legged jump. Okay. Now, when Julio Jones jumped, not only was there a violent arm swing, but there was also greater hip flexion. There was greater knee flexion. There was greater dorsiflexion. All of that maximize the distance at which acceleration could be generated. Okay, so whenever he jumped, he was able to maximize the acceleration and really the force output in order to propel himself forward, or as forward as he did. All right, and I mean, according to the video and the reaction to the players, it seemed like it was a phenomenal feat because I guess the other players weren't able to do it as much. Okay, same thing with the infant throw. The infant he went from here to here, and that was it. That was like the only preparatory movement that he did before he tried to release the ball. Whereas the major leaguer, I mean, there was trunk rotation, there was knee flexion, there was abduction, there was internal rotation. I mean, there was so much that it allowed him to generate a lot of a lot more acceleration, and thus his force output was much greater. Okay, so and then I guess the key difference also is whenever if you took the Major League Baseball player and you had him perform the same movement that infant performed, then the mass would have been the same, right? Because it's his hand or his arm or his body, the mass is the same. Okay, but the difference is the acceleration. Because if he would have thrown the ball like this, there wouldn't have been a great opportunity for acceleration. But since he used his entire body, same mass, but he used his entire body and he released it, it allowed him to create more acceleration. Okay, and that's what Newton's law is saying, is that the more acceleration is produced, the more opportunity for acceleration, the greater the force output. Okay, so if you yourself were kicking a ball and if you stood stiff-legged and just simply kicked the ball like that, it would be the same mass as if you were to run up to it, get into a preparatory stance and really deliver the ball. All you're doing is same mass. All you're doing is creating a greater opportunity for acceleration, and the result is greater force output. Okay, so that's why the kicker stood back about 5 yards. He had a preparatory phase. That's why a basketball player bends at the legs and jumps up high, because it creates more opportunity for acceleration. Okay. So that's why we do, even in baseball. I mean, baseball, you just don't stand here and just swing the bat. You stand here, and then you have we still call it a slight cock, and then it gives you a greater chance for acceleration through the swing. All right, so all of us do that in our proficient movements. So again, analyzing the open kinetic chain, we're analyzing all of these isolated movements that allow us to perform the skills proficiently. All right, so yeah, I'm hoping that this becomes more noticeable. Okay, so I guess this is pretty much what I was saying. I mean, think about you. Think about how you would throw the ball as hard as you can, or how you would kick the ball as hard as you can. What are the things that you would do in order to maximize your force output? I mean, you wouldn't just stand there and just kick the ball. I mean, you would, back up and you would run to it and boom, really deliver a force to the ball in order to kick the ball as far as you could. Okay. But again, this goes back to the balance versus mobility concept. There's a trade-off. All right. And at first, we want to maintain balance because we're uncertain of the environment. We're uncertain of the situation. But once we become confident that, we're not going to get hurt, that there's no reason to fear, then it allows us to increase our mobility at the expense of balance. Okay, so going back to Newton's third law of motion, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and really it just applies to understanding Newton's first law of motion. Yeah, I guess we can just move along with this. I guess the final concept that we'll discuss in this chapter are the movements around the limbs. Hopefully you realize, okay, with everything we do, we obviously perform a lot of isolated movements, but if you think about it, all of those isolated movements are they occur at the joints, which creates what's called the angular movement. Angular movement is in reference to the change in angle. So if you're cocking your leg in preparation for a kick, I mean, obviously you have to flex your knee in order to extend your knee. So there's a change in angle around that joint. That's where we get the term angular movement. And the difference between angular movement and linear movement is in a straight line. It's actually the result of angular motion. All right, so I think I explained this earlier in this discussion, where our movements, even though we create linear movement, we're actually engaging in several isolated angular movements. We can't move. Our body doesn't move linearly. Our body can produce linear movement, like I mentioned earlier. I can move my hand in a linear motion, but it requires me to perform certain movements at the wrist, elbow, and shoulder joints in order to perform the hand, and in order to propel the hand in a linear fashion, forwards and backwards. Okay, and that's what we do with all our sports. Okay, all our movements, I should say. So it says here that the maximum force occurs when our limbs reach full extension. This is either at contact or release. Okay, so if you're shooting a basketball, our maximum force is whenever we fully extend our arm and our wrist, and you can't really see, but we flex our wrist, right? Same thing with kicking a ball. I mean, we kick. We have our knee bent. I'm trying to give you some visuals. We have our knee bent, and then we kick at full extension. All right. So that's when we produce maximum force. All right. So if we just walk up to with a knee bent and then we kick with the knee bent, we're not producing maximum force. Okay. So why do we begin? I mean, why don't we, if maximum force is what's needed for if full extension is needed for maximum force, why don't we just perform all movements at full extension? And the reason why is because less energy is needed to begin movement in the bent form. So, in other words, why do we begin all movements in the bent or cocked position? So, in other words, whenever we look at the proficient kicker, especially looking at the video, his leg wasn't fully extended until the point of contact. Prior to that, his knee, whenever he started his kick, his knee was bent, right? And the reason why is because if he was to propel his leg at full extension throughout the kick, it would require much more energy. Okay, and again, that's we're looking at inertia. An object's resistance to motion. So an object in full extension would require it generates more inertia, and it requires more energy to move. All right, so everything we do starts in a bent or cocked position. All right, my slides are frozen. So again, looking at these videos, if we were to perform the infant leg kick, if that child never bent his leg, her leg, it would produce a lot. It would require a lot more force in order to kick the ball. Whereas the proficient kicker, again, I'm going to try to stop it right at the point of. Oh, I almost had it. Right there. You can see how the leg is fully cocked and not fully extended. So by the time he kicks it, at that point, he reaches full extension at the point of contact. I missed it. You can see how the leg is fully extended at that point. Let's see if we get a better angle. You see the leg is still not fully extended until contact. You can see the leg, well, you can see the leg on the left side of the screen, but I'll try to pause the video at a better time frame. Very close to full extension. Very close to full extension at that point. Okay. So these are all, they're just simple concepts that we use in trying to become more proficient in our movement. So remember, as beginners, there's laws that limit us from performing proficient movement, and it's really just an understanding of the balance mobility trade-off. When we become more confident in the skills that we're performing, we start to become more and more reliant on speed and less reliant on balance. But that concludes chapter 3. That was our balance and stability chapter. And hopefully you guys start to understand the concept of the open kinetic chain, because from here on out, we'll start talking about how, not only with laws of motion, but also how the development of the body affects the open kinetic chain. It allows us to generate more and more force output in order to perform, skills on a more proficient level. All right. Well, if you guys have any questions, please email me. I'm going to put together a video for your video discussions momentarily.